Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to be doing a beginner's guide to plasticity. Now, we have several different beginner guides and quick start guides for plasticity. We recently released one that was focused on users that had CAD experience, either coming from things like Blender or 3D Studio or Maya, or CAD programs like Fusion or SolidWorks or Inventor. That video was intended for those that had some skill and knowledge around this and really just needed help understanding how the program worked. This video is for users that have either little to no skill in any other CAD program, or they're just getting started and they need a little bit more help understanding where things are in plasticity and how it works. So on this channel, we already have a couple different playlists and lots of videos and things that you can try, from 3D printing to making different kinds of basic objects. And we have a course on our website, learneverythingaboutdesign.com, where we do this speaker housing that you see on the screen here. So if you are brand new, just getting started, you downloaded a trial of plasticity, you want to figure out what it's all about, then this video should help you along. We're going to cover quite a bit, but to get started, first we're going to talk about what plasticity is. So plasticity is a direct modeling program. It lets you create complex solids and surface models for general design purposes. These can be things like 3D printing, they could be used for animation or rendering or visual effects. But I would say currently, if your goal is to design parts for manufacture, so if you're intended to CNC machine parts or design them for injection molding, I would personally say that this is not the right program for you. While it is possible to create those kinds of designs here, the process and the workflow and the ability to create things like parametric sketches that can be modified and edited downstream, those things are not existent inside of plasticity. So if your end goal is to start to learn to design objects for injection molding or to design objects to be CNC machined, just note that there are other programs available, things like Fusion and SolidWorks, where you design parts and sketches and you put a lot of dimensions into those and then you build the features up from there. The workflow is still very similar, but there are just some things that are missing from plasticity because that's really not what it's intended to be. So it's really meant to be somewhere in between those traditional parametric CAD programs and programs like Blender or 3D Studio or Maya, where you're actually modeling with meshes and you're creating objects for things like video game assets or rendering animation, TV, movies, those kinds of things. So plasticity takes the workflow of something like Blender and combines it with the geometry, solids and surfaces that you would typically get in a prismatic and parametric CAD program. So it's kind of that in between. So again, if you're just getting started and you don't really know what program to choose, if you think about it, if you're just trying to design parts for 3D printing, then this program will probably work fine for you. If your intention is to create these sort of hard surface type models that are maybe a little bit difficult to do in other programs like Blender, then it's a good program for you. But if you're really interested in designing for manufacture, consumer type products, or products for CNC machining, then I would suggest going with another program, just personally. So now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about plasticity in general and how to get you started. So plasticity in general, when you first open it up, you're going to have a cube in the middle of the screen. Now I'm going to be using the speaker model for a little bit until we go to do some actual modeling on our own, just simply because it's got a few elements I want to point out. But basically, when you first get started, you want to go up to your user preferences at the P menu in the top left, and you want to take a look at your navigation settings. Now, when you go to your navigation settings, you want to find something that you're comfortable with. I personally prefer plasticity default, even though I do use Blender and I do use Fusion and I use other programs. I find that the way that the plasticity default is set up is the best way for me. So you will want to come in and take a look at this. Once you have looked at those settings, then spend some time playing around, understanding how you can move your objects around. So if you're using the default plasticity setting, you're going to hold down the middle mouse button Now, if you have a traditional style mouse, then you're going to push down the mouse wheel. If you have a CAD mouse where you've got 3 buttons, then you'll have an actual third button. But for the most part, you'll push that down and that'll allow you to orbit your object. Once again, inside of the user preferences, there are settings, for example, rotate around cursor, and you've got, zoom to cursor, zoom vertical, and so on. You want to just double check those. If it doesn't behave how you would expect it to behave, then just play around with that. And the reason for that is because where you put your cursor is going to have an impact. So for example, if I go down to the bottom right-hand corner and I start moving this up and down, you can kind of see that the object is rotating about pretty much an invisible line across the screen. If I do this in the upper left-hand corner, it's doing the same thing. You can kind of think of this as a swing on a rope or a chain. And if I am up at the top of the screen, it's going to be swinging below that rope. And if I'm on the bottom of the screen, it's going to be kind of above it. And if you're right in the middle, then it'll just be about your cursor. So generally, when you're moving things around, you are probably going to have your cursor close to the center of the screen. So you may not even notice this, but if you end up being like way up here in the corner, then you're going to notice that it's swinging about wherever your cursor is. So once you're free rotating and you're comfortable with that, then holding down the right mouse button will let you pan. Now the right mouse button in Plasticity by default is also the confirmation button. So we can hit enter or return depending on your keyboard, or you can hold down the right mouse button and that will be the OK, confirm, or like finish off whatever you're doing. The other thing that we need to do is we need to zoom in and out. Now, typically you do this with the mouse wheel by scrolling in and out. You can also do this by holding down Control and then holding down the mouse button, and that will let you zoom in and out. So you can see I'm kind of moving the mouse around. Generally this is left to right, up and down doesn't really do anything, but left and right will let you zoom in and out. And this is a little bit smoother than doing it with the mouse wheel, especially if you've got like a turbo scroll mouse wheel and the model just kind of goes crazy. You may find that you like to hold in Control and then just kind of move the cursor left and right. This is going to be the first thing that you should be really comfortable with. You need to make sure that you're comfortable with moving the object around, rotating it, panning it, zooming. If you aren't, then the rest of Plasticity or really any CAD program is going to get real frustrating because the object's never going to be quite where you want it. We are going to do a full walkthrough of the UI. But before we ever do any of that, I think it is important that you at least just play with this with the cube and get yourself comfortable. Once you're comfortable with that, now we can move on and talk a little bit more about the UI. So with the UI, or user interface, there are a lot of different areas. And we need to get comfortable with a couple of key areas, and some of them are not going to be nearly as important, but we'll talk about all of them. So first, we've already looked at the P drop-down menu. This is where you do things like start a new file, open, import, append. If you want to add things like import another model or an image or something like that, that's where you'll do this. Quick save, export, save a scene, preferences, and so on. So all that's going to be in that sort of P drop-down menu. Just to the left of that, or to the right of that, I'm sorry, you'll have toggle sidebar. Now, if I do that, this sidebar over here, which is called the outliner, is going to go away. So if you happen to need just a little bit more room for modeling, especially if you're on a smaller screen, and you can toggle that in and out by using Control and B on the keyboard or just by clicking that option. The outliner is important, but it's not required that it's there all the time. So you can hide it and model just fine without it and then bring it back when you need it. So the outliner here on the left-hand side is going to contain basically all of the objects that are in your design. Now, when I say objects, this is kind of a general term, but things like construction planes, the solid bodies will be here, surface bodies or sheets as they're called in Plasticity will be in here, curves, so these are things like your lines, your arcs, your circles, even images will be in here. And if you import mesh bodies, so if you have a mesh reference from maybe an STL download or a 3D scan, that information will be organized here as well. And by default, those are going to be in their own areas. So planes, solids, sheets, and so on. But you can actually create groups. So at the bottom left here, there's a create group option where you can organize these. So for example, I have a group for speaker curves, and I just put curves in there. We've got hardware, and this has got solid bodies in it. We've got a group here for the connection hardware, and I've got a group for the feet, which are the ones on the bottom. And while I've organized these based on certain things like hardware, they can contain solids and surfaces and curves and all those sorts of things in those groups. And what's really nice about this is you can hide and show an entire group at the same time. And you also have options to do things like change whether or not it can be selected on the screen. You can lock it. And that's just kind of a good way to organize your designs, especially once you start to get, let's just say, a dozen screws or bolts in a design. It can be kind of a pain if everything is listed here. You may find that you want to turn things on and off in a different manner, and you want to be able to do that in an entire group. So like selecting or turning on or off the entire group. So once we're in here, we can right click and we can select all, which will select everything in that group. We can also add the selection, the current selection to this group. So if we want to add more stuff to it, we can create a new subgroup, so a subfolder in there, and we can also expand and collapse it. Materials we're going to talk about a little bit later, so not as important in plasticity, but for right now, just note that materials based on groups is also an option. All right, so everything on the left-hand side is your outliner, and now you're aware of the things that get put in there and the fact that we can create groups. As we're going to move around the UI, we'll talk about each area and kind of explain what it does. And then after we get done with the UI, we'll dive into actually modeling. So if you are already a little bit familiar with plasticity and you want to jump ahead to the next chapter, then go ahead and do that. We're going to go through everything, where everything is and kind of what it does. So in the top left of our screen, we have our selection filters. Now, selection filters are important for a few reasons. There are different types of objects that we can select. So for example, a control point, an edge, a face, or an entire body. The body can be a surface body or a solid body, but in this case, the reason this is important is because the default workflow, if we've got everything selected, is to first select a body, and then we can drill down from there by selecting, let's say, an edge, and then applying a fillet or a chamfer to it, or what we can do is we can select a body and then select a face, and then we can manipulate the face by pulling or pushing it. And these are the general workflows. Not a big deal if you're just getting started and you're working on a simple object, maybe just one single solid body. But as you start to work on multiple solid bodies and you want to get a little bit more detailed, what you're going to find is that changing the selection filter to the thing that you want to select. So for example, edges. This will let me just select the edges on multiple bodies without having to go through the process of pre-selecting the body. So that's why it's important to understand that the selection filter makes a big difference, especially as you get deeper into design and you've got multiple solid bodies or surface bodies that you're working on. In order to toggle back and forth between these, you can just simply click on them. You can hold down the Shift key and then you can add to your selection. But more commonly, you want to get used to doing some shortcut keys. You don't have to remember every shortcut key, but the numbers at the top of your keyboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, will be the quickest way for you to go to, say, an edge selection by hitting 2, bring all back by hitting 5. Also note that you can hit the Tab key to go back to all selection as long as you're not currently doing something. And what I mean by that is if you're, let's say, drawing a line, then hitting Tab is going to jump to the dimension for the line rather than changing your selection filter. So I would just get comfortable with using 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 across the top of the keyboard, and that's going to help you quickly go back and forth between your selection filters. In most cases, you're likely going to jump between all and maybe the edge selection. There are times when we just want control point selections. For example, if we are working with complex curves that have a lot of internal control points, or if we're using some more advanced tools like raising the degree of a complex body, and we want to control it by pulling and pushing control points around, then you generally want to go to that control point option. Some cases you may not even see the control points if that's not active. So that's the option in the top left corner. Again, that's going to be our selection filter. As we move to the top right corner, this is going to be our view modes. And there are a couple things that happen here. So the first one is going to toggle back and forth between perspective and ortho. Now, a perspective view is basically how we see objects. If you are looking at a really long object, let's say a train, the front of the train is going to look much bigger to you than the back of the train, simply based on the distance away from your eyes. And this is true with objects as well. Things that are relatively close to us and are small tend to not have very much perspective, but in reality, they all have some amount of perspective. Now, the reason you would want to go to a pure orthographic view is because when we're modeling things like curves and we're adding features, oftentimes we want to see those in an orthographic view because it's much easier for us to not deal with the distortion or the difference between the front and the back of an object. Now, even if you are on perspective view and we go to, let's say, a front view, a default front view, when we're on this default front view or any of these construction planes, then it's going to automatically be an orthographic view. It's not going to be perspective until we start to rotate it around. So again, if we're looking at it from the front, that's going to be an orthographic view. As soon as I start to rotate it, it's going to hop back to a perspective view. So you can obviously see there's a big difference in how this looks. So as you're modeling, you'll likely get comfortable with one method or the other. Generally, I work with perspective on at pretty much all the time. And I only look at those orthographic views when I'm going to do things like create curves or sketch geometry. So that's the first button here. That's perspective and ortho mode. Also note the shortcut key is numpad 5. So if you're working on a traditional keyboard or if you have a laptop that has a numpad on it, that numpad 5, assuming your numlock is on, is going to allow you to toggle back and forth between those. The next option that we have here is called our overlays. Now, the overlays are actually going to be our coordinate system. So as I rotate this around, this might be a little bit easier to see. If I toggle this off, the grid at the bottom and the X, Y, and Z axes, the red, green, and blue, are going to be our overlays. In some cases, you may just want to turn that off if you don't need to see it. But in a lot of cases, when you're getting started on a design, you want it there as a reference. So you know where the center of the design is, you can snap to it, and you can use the X, Y, and Z axes. Also note that X, Y, and Z is not going to change. Even if we toggle that off, it's still going to be in the same location. So it doesn't change anything on a functional level. It just changes what you can see. The next option here is toggle X-ray mode. Now, X-ray mode allows us to see into objects and see all of the edges. So think about it as keeping our solid shading, but allowing us to see the detail inside of an object. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we can easily select through objects. You may still need to be very careful about your selection process, but if you're doing things like adding fillets to a cube, you may want to have X-ray mode on so that way you can see and select edges behind the cube without having to rotate it around to all the different views. Once you get a little bit further in a design, it usually makes sense to turn this off so you don't see too much detail that isn't really needed for what you're doing. In some cases, it'll just be on by default and you may need to toggle it off manually. The next option here is called toggle render mode. So when we turn this on by left clicking, it's going to change the appearance of everything we're looking at. If I right click, you can see that we can change these materials. They're called matte caps. And we can go to different materials, even things like draft analysis or zebra stripes to check our curvature. And we can go back to sort of flat materials and shiny materials. I generally will keep it on this sort of softer matte gray finish. And then at the bottom of this, you can see that we can toggle on and off things like show edges, and we can toggle on and off things like show faces. So if you want to work in what's traditionally called a wireframe view, you can turn the faces of the object off. If you want to see it a little bit more realistically, you can turn off the edges. The edges are still there. It doesn't change the geometry at all. It just allows us to view it differently. So I'm going to turn those back on. It's kind of the default setting. And while we're here, I will go ahead and quickly mention materials. It's not going to be a big focus of this video, but I did mention it with right-clicking over here that there is an add material option. So materials are a way for us to change the appearance of something. And we do this by either right-clicking on it and adding a material, or by just simply hitting M on the keyboard. What we're doing with material is generally changing the color of something. So we're going to come in and let's say we want to make this black and then right click to accept. Now you don't instantly see this, and partially it's because of our render mode. So if we turn the render mode on, you can see here that this is black. If we toggle it back off, you can see that it's not shown. So those materials will show a little dot with whatever color you set here. And that little dot can be changed. We can hit M on the materials and let's say make it red this time. And then I go back to my render mode and now we can see it's red. We can go back to this sort of render mode off. So that it's a nice way that we can kind of identify objects based on their color and not really affect the geometry at all. You're not going to be doing any rendering in Plasticity. That's generally what you would take it to another program for, but it's nice that we have some visualization options. So if you want to make all the speaker hardware, for example, all of this, you wanted to make it a specific color. Let's say all the speaker hardware needs to be black. So now when we go to render mode, the speaker hardware itself is black, and then we can make things like the cone and the trim ring in whatever colors we want, just to differentiate them on the screen. So that's basics for materials and some of the options we have in the top right corner for what's called the view modes. Now let's go ahead and move on to the view cube, which is just below that. Now the view cube lets us quickly see X, Y, and Z. We can also click on X, Y, or Z and change the view orientation. And we can also click on one of the faces of the view cube to do the same thing. The benefit of doing this is once we get into doing our practice where we're actually creating curves, is that the curves themselves need to be planar if we want to use them for things like an extrude to create a solid body or a revolve or some of these other tools. And the reason for that is because when we create these things, they're going to show a shaded profile in the center of it. And if you have that shaded profile, that's going to allow us to build out something in 3D, like an extrude and build out a solid body. Now, in this case, I don't actually need it, so I'm going to delete that. But in order to do that efficiently, we want to work with these planes. And one way to get to them is by using the view cube, clicking on X, Y, or Z, or by simply clicking on the X, Y, or Z or sections of the cube that you want. There are other ways to do this, and the most common way is to use the numpad. Now the numpad, number 1, is going to give you your front view. Control and 1 will give you a back view. The number 3 will give you right view, control and 3 will give you left, and 7 will give you top, and control and 7 will give you bottom. So getting comfortable with these different keys is the quickest way. And then using the view cube at times to click on the X, Y, or Z or the faces is another way that we can do this. We'll get into construction planes just a little bit more in a moment, but get comfortable with at least looking at the view cube to help you with your orientation. And then if you need to click on it, go ahead and use that. Remember that with these default views, we're going to be looking at it as an orthographic object, and then perspective will come back if we have it turned on as soon as we begin to rotate. Just below the view cube in the right-hand side of our screen, we have what's called our tools. This menu will be here always. It doesn't matter what we have selected or what we're doing. And it's the place where we're going to get access to our creation tools. Now, the creation tools typically are either curves, things like lines, arcs, circles. We have some tools to modify those, like bridging 2 curves together, trimming or extending them. And then at the bottom, we have what are called primitives. Now, primitives are geometry that we can easily create. These can be used for the starting shape of an object, or we can use them for example, creating a hole using the cylinder option. These are ways in which we can start a design or add additional detail to a design without creating curves. And you're generally going to have a hybrid approach to this. And what I mean by that is you're going to use some primitives, you're going to use some curves, and some of the other tools that we'll get into. So just keep in mind that these tools will always be displayed here on the right-hand side. If you see any of them that have a small gray arrow in the bottom corner, hold down the left mouse button and you'll see there are other options there. So for example, instead of the extend option, we've got splitting a curve or inserting CV into the curve. We've got options for additional circles and arcs, and then for the splines and so on. And then just keep that in mind that anytime you see that gray arrow, that means there are more underneath that menu. While we're over here on the right-hand side, let's go ahead and hop into this right-hand side, which is divided up into three areas. We've got our grid snaps at the top, we've got our construction planes, and then we've got performance at the bottom. There is one other thing that appears when we select an object. We'll actually get some information about that. This is called like a detail display. So first, let's talk about grids and snaps. Generally, at least my personal preference is to turn snaps off. I generally don't use it for a grid. Now, if you turn on snap to grid, what this means is that as you create objects, it's actually snapping to different locations. And if we zoom in, we'll probably be able to see this a bit better. It's snapping to the different points on the grid. Some people prefer to work that way. Again, I personally don't, but you can toggle the amount or the increment of that grid by using the plus and minus here. Enable snapping for objects, and if we click this three dots here, it'll show you that we can snap to faces, curves, or shell edges. And what this means is that as I hover my cursor over, you can see it says face next to it. As I go to an edge, it says edge face, mid edge face, center, and it'll give you information about what you're clicking. This is important because as we get into things like top-down views, you'll notice that it says face here, and over here it says XY. If I start on the XY and click, now over here it says face XY. This means that I'm referencing the face, for example, the center of the face, and if I click there and then come back over, what that's actually showing me is that even though I reference the face, that is actually on the XY plane. So pay close attention to what you see next to the cursor. You'll be able to tell if it's on the face or if it's on an edge or a midpoint. And you can also tell by the orientation of that small black circle where your normal direction is pointing. So for example, if we were up here on top, it's pointing up. But if we go to an edge, it's going normal or along the tangency direction of that edge. The reason that this is important is because as you begin creating curves, you want to pay close attention to what is listed next to that cursor. It's going to make a big difference for you. So as we go further down, we've got construction planes. And just like the default top, front, right, left, back, bottom planes, we have access to those here. So for example, I can left click on XY. This means that I'm going to be sketching or creating my curves in the XY. And if I double click on it, it'll go normal to that view so I can look straight down on it. You'll also note that we have the options to create additional construction planes. We can see plane 0 over here. We can also see it over here. So if I make a plane from a selection, for example, this top face, it's going to go normal to that view, and then I can save this as a custom plane. I can also do this from a viewing angle. This can be helpful when you're creating conceptual models. You may want to just create a plane from the camera angle, and then you can add details at that orientation, save the plane if you want, and then you can hit X to get off of it. Anytime we've saved a plane, we can left click to activate it or double click to activate it and go normal to it. And then we hit X to get off of it. So these planes are going to be the way that we're going to start creating curves and ensuring that our curves are staying planar or on that 2D sketch plane. Now, as we go down to the bottom, we've got this performance section. One thing you'll notice with the performance section is that you probably aren't going to pay close attention to it. If you happen to notice a performance issue, if things seem to be lagging, if you have a huge number of patterns or objects, you can always go to your preferences into the performance section and you can turn down the faceting quality, which basically is going to make your objects not seem as smooth. You can also go to lower GPU rendering quality and see if that helps out your performance. But for the most part, it's just going to be something that's there. And unless you have a problem, you're probably not even going to bother with it. And the last thing that displays down here, again, is based on your selection. So if we select a solid, it'll give us things like the volume. If we select an edge, it'll give us the X, Y, Z, and the length. If we select a face, it'll give us the area. If it's in this case, if it's actually cylindrical, it'll give you things like the radius value and so on. So that information can be pretty helpful, especially if you're trying to figure out, for example, the volume of a part if you're going to be 3D printing it. Okay, so there's really only two more areas that we need to talk about before we get into modeling. The bottom left is going to be some of these default commands, things that are always displayed here. Now, these are tools like move, rotate, and scale. Also, Boolean, which is a way that we either combine solid bodies together or have one solid body subtracted from another or keep the overlap between solid bodies. That's the Boolean tool, and that's going to always be displayed here. Cut with a curve, mirror, as well as some duplicate options. So these are always going to be here. The rest of the tools are going to be found in a couple of different ways. The three dots at the bottom right is going to show our command palette. Now, this is going to be a long list of everything that's available. And in this list, you'll also see the shortcut keys displayed on the right-hand side. You can right-click on any of these and assign a new shortcut key. You can revert back to the default shortcut, and you can also add it to favorites. So for example, if we add it to favorites, that's going to place it in a little section just below the search bar, but above this list. The reason that that's nice is because that command palette also shows up anytime you hit the F key. And what that means is if we have a couple tools we use all the time, we don't have a shortcut key or we don't really want to assign a shortcut key, we can put it here, and then that quickly lets us create that object without having to go searching for it. Now, in the case of polygon, that's a little silly because it's over here, but keeping it closer to the cursor can be helpful. Now, if you want to change that, what you need to do is you need to go back and find it. So I'm going to go ahead and search for polygon, right click, and remove it from my favorites. So again, F key or the three dots in the bottom right, it's going to get you to the same place. The last thing that we're going to do to access commands is going to be make a selection. So when we select something, we're going to have a contextual list of all of the commands. Now, this is not every command you can use. It's just going to be some of the most common. So if you select a solid body, you may want to unjoin it. And this means taking all of the faces of that solid body and making them individual surfaces or sheets. We also may want to do rectangular or circular array, or radial array as it's called. You may want to project a curve onto or onto surfaces. Or if we go a bit deeper and we select, say, an edge, you can see that we've got a pipe tool, we've got extrude, we've got loft tools, we've got other tools for dealing with patching surfaces or offsetting curves. If we select a face, this is going to default to the offset face tool, but you can see here that we've got a different list of tools available to us. So those contextual tools oftentimes will give you a hint at what you can do. As you're getting started, it can be helpful to know, all right, well, if I select this face, if I begin pulling on it, this is the offset face tool by default. But if I select that face and come down here, I could do a draft, I could match it to another face, I could maybe do a sweep operation or revolve. In this case, I could extrude it. And extrude is different than pull because it's going to take that face and move it up in 3D. And it doesn't really care about the tangency or the curvature of the corner. It's just adding this new geometry. So keep that in mind that with these kinds of tools, there are these contextual tools that you can get access to. Another thing to note in the bottom right-hand corner is that we're oftentimes going to see shortcut keys displayed here. Whenever you start a command, so in this case, fillet, we'll have a dialog in the bottom left that gives us all the information about what we can do. So the dimensions, whether or not we want to change the shape of it. For example, a conic fillet versus a G2 fillet, it's going to have a different definition on how it deals with curvature into and out of it. In the bottom right, the list of shortcut keys lets us know what kinds of things we can do. If we want to make a variable radius fillet, for example, or if we want to add a limit, telling it where we want the fillet to start and stop, all of those things can be done with shortcut keys by looking in that bottom right-hand corner. I'm going to hit escape on this because I don't really want to modify it, but those are going to be all of the basic areas of the user interface in Plasticity. Before we start modeling, I do think it is important, again, that you are comfortable with rotating your object around, that you can pan it, and that you can zoom in and out. Now, if you have those things down, the next steps will be a lot easier. If you are still not comfortable with that aspect of it, then make sure that you do spend just a couple minutes and get comfortable. Try your hand at moving it to the top left corner and then moving it to the bottom right, or rotating around to one side and then rotating it around to the other side, and seeing how that works for you. Now, once you're done with that, we're going to go to our P drop-down menu and we're going to start a new file. Even if you haven't done anything to that cube, just start fresh, start clean, and start a new file. The first thing that I want to do is make sure that we go up to our preferences, go to our units, and we want to set our units to millimeters. We're going to set the grid size to 250 and accent lines every 25. And what this is going to mean is that the overall size of that grid that we have is 250 millimeters by 250 millimeters. And one of the main reasons that we want to do this is because we want a sense of scale when we're modeling. Now, by default, you're likely going to be in the meter unit system, and you're going to be creating some extremely large objects. Most of the time, you want to go to millimeter or inches, depending on what you're doing. Once we have that set up, just left click, we're going to select the cube, and we want to get rid of it. We want to either hit delete on your keyboard or X, and those will get rid of it for you. And from here, now we want to zoom in. And the easiest way to do this is with a shortcut key that's /. Now, / is going to be one that you probably use quite a bit, even if you're not comfortable with any other shortcut key. Being able to zoom to fit your entire scene or your selected object is one of those shortcut keys that I think is essential to making the most out of your time with plasticity. Now that we're kind of zoomed in and we're ready to start modeling, we don't have anything on the screen. We deleted our cube and we got our units set, but we don't have any geometry yet. So before we make any geometry, double check in your upper left-hand corner to make sure that all 4 of your selection filters are on. A lot of times by default, you'll come in and the control points will be off and you may see something like this. So hit 5 on your numbers or the tab key to make sure that they're all turned on. Now that we want to start creating geometry, it's important to note that there's actually a handful of ways that we can do this in plasticity. We've got our tools on the right-hand side, and we've got our curves at the top, and we've got our primitives at the bottom. If the object that you're trying to make can start with a sphere or a cylinder or a box, a lot of times it makes sense to use those primitives as a starting point. So for example, if we wanted to start with a cylinder, we could just start to drag it out, hit the tab key, make it whatever size we want, and then drag it up into 3D. Again, we can hit a tab key in some cases on certain features, and in other cases, you may actually need to left click and then come over here and enter a value manually. Why some dialog boxes let you tab to them and others don't, I really don't have an answer for that. But if you find yourself hitting tab and not going over to the dialog box, just left click to confirm the dimension you're dragging and then tab over to it. So if your design starts with a cylinder, this is a great way to get started. Then you can add all the features you want. The more common way for us, I'm going to hit escape for this. The more common way, because most shapes are going to start maybe a little bit more complex, is to start with curves. Now, the most basic of those curves is going to be a line. But remember that we want to make sure that we are working inside of these construction planes. So we're going to start by going to our top view. That's going to be 7 on the numpad, or again, you can click Z or the top face on your view cube. This will be a little bit hard to see, but we have a green axis in the middle going up and down, and we have a red axis in the middle going left and right. The red one is our X, and the green one is going to be Y. We're going to be able to snap to these, and we want to always start at the origin. It's going to be the best way to create your models is to use symmetry and work about the origin whenever possible. It's not always possible, but in most cases it is. So oftentimes when we're creating a new design, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using reference geometry, or we're going to be moving geometry to specific locations. And I'm going to show you an example of both of those. We're going to be making a simple linkage, and it's going to have 2 cylindrical sides, a left and a right, and then we're going to add some more detail to it. So if I know that this feature is going to go from the origin, it's going to go out to the right a certain distance, I may make a construction line or some sort of sacrificial geometry. So left clicking at the origin, hitting tab, and then entering a value of 100 and hit the enter key. So now what I've done is I've created a position out in space that's 100 millimeters away from my origin. And now I can use something like a circle by snapping to that, dragging this out, hitting tab and entering a value of 100 millimeters and hitting enter again. So now I know exactly where this circle is. It's 100 millimeter diameter and it's 100 millimeters from the origin. Another way that we can do this is by creating our geometry at the origin. Let's go ahead and hit Tab and make this one 75 millimeters and hit Enter. And with it selected, we're going to go to our Move tool, and we're going to move it in the X direction a specific amount. So click here and go minus 75 millimeters and hit Enter. So instead of creating a 75 millimeter line from the origin to the center point where we want to place our circle, we simply drew it at the origin and moved it to the right location. Another way you can do this, of course, is turning on Snap to Grid if your grid size is a certain amount that makes sense for you. So in our example, the grid size was set up at 25 millimeters. So you can see here our 100 millimeter circle goes from 1, 2, 3, and 4 of these. So it's exactly 100 millimeters, exactly 4 of those grids. So you can use that as a reference if you want. I don't need this line in the middle anymore, so I'm going to select it and hit delete. Now that we've got the basis for our design, I need to add some more geometry. So I'm going to use my line tool. I'm going to start by left clicking over here, drag over, and notice that it's giving me a red or a pink line on the screen. That's the tangency direction. However, if I drag over to this other circle, as soon as I get close to tangency, notice it says tan, curve XY. So the tan means that it's tangent on the starting and tangent on the ending point based on our curve, and it's on the XY plane. So if you watch the point on the left circle, you can see as we get close to that tangency point, it's actually moving. So we want to make sure it's tangency around, so we're going to left click there and then right click to confirm. We're going to go back to our line tool and we'll do the same thing on the bottom. Again, moving until we see the cursor, it says tan/tan, curve, in this case it says region, which is fine, and XY. So we'll left click, then right click to accept. Now that we've added these, we've got 3 closed profile areas. These can each be used as extrudes, but keep in mind that our curves are these circles on the end, and then we've got these 2 additional lines. Notice that it's 4 objects inside of our curves and the outliner. You don't have to trim and join and combine these things together, but in some instances it will make sense. For our purposes, however, I want to highlight a couple of extra unique things that we can do in Plasticity. So first, I'm going to go ahead and grab the circle tool. I'm going to go back to the center point here, begin dragging this out, and I want to make a quick note here as well. So as we're moving this out and I'm snapping to a vertical position, wherever we click is going to be the start and end point of a circle. Now, this may not seem like a big deal, but in some instances, you want to be very careful where you put that point because you may need to trim or snap to it later on. So it is a good idea to try to work within those coordinates of being in that first quadrant or second quadrant or third quadrant, just so you know where that point is. Then I'm going to hit Tab, and I'm going to make this specific circle 50 millimeters and hit Enter. We're going to repeat the process, noting that we're not really talking about shortcut keys, but all of these things have shortcut keys. For example, Shift and R can repeat the last command, but we're not worried about that. So we'll go ahead and hit Tab, and we'll make this one 75 millimeters. The next thing that we want to do is we want to create an offset of this profile right here. So when we think about this, we don't have a curve that goes to this point and comes back around. This is just a region, a closed profile. But Plasticity doesn't really care. We can still use that and create an offset. So you can either use a shortcut key O, or you can come down and look for the offset command because again, it's contextual. So we'll select offset, and then we need to begin pulling this either inward or outward. Now notice as we go outward, it's creating the offset and it's adding this arc here. As we go inward, it's got a sharp corner. So we're going to start to get it roughly where we want and then manually enter a value of minus 10 millimeters and hit enter. So this is going to allow us to create an opening in the center of our link as we cut through. So we pretty much have all the geometry we need. We can go ahead and rotate and then begin pulling this up. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select these 3 regions and then begin extruding this up. I'm going to hit Tab on the keyboard, and notice in the bottom right, Tab locks distances. So essentially what we're doing is we're saying the positive distance and the negative distance is the same. Let's go ahead and make that value 20 millimeters and hit enter. Next, we want to add a little bit more geometry. We want to make the area around the bosses thicker. So what we're going to do is we're going to temporarily hide this, and I'm going to go ahead and select these and begin pulling them up. Once again, hit Tab, bring my solid body back, and instead of setting this at 20 millimeters, we can say set it at 25. So it's going to give us a little bit of an extra lip there, and then we can hit enter. The rest of the geometry here is going to be created a few different ways. So I'm going to select all of the curves and hit H on the keyboard to hide. We can also manually do that by clicking on the eyeball icon, which will allow us to show or hide those curves. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to create a cut or a recess in the middle of this. But keep in mind, now we've got 3 solid bodies. They didn't join back together, or they didn't join together automatically. So we want to join them together with the Boolean tool. So we're going to select an object, select Boolean, and then hold down Shift and select these two. Notice it's showing in red. What we want to do here is called Union. So we're going to select Union and then right click. Now, if we look in the outliner, we should have one single solid body and not multiples. At this point, the next thing that we want to do is we want to start to adjust the geometry and make some changes. So what we're going to do is hit 1 on the numpad, or again, click up here to go to our front view, or click the XZ option to go to our XZ plane. What I want to do is I want to separate this area back here. I want the link to be open. And the way I'm going to do this is by starting a line. I'm going to go from the origin. So I'm going to find the origin. Notice that when I do this, there are a couple of snaps that are happening. It's trying to snap to a face, but I'm going to left click and then just drag it off to the right and accept, then rotate this around to make sure that it is actually at the origin. So again, go back to that front view. It could be the back view if you want, but we're going to go to the front view, which is 1 on the numpad. And then I'm going to take this line and I want to move it. So move in the Z direction, and we're going to move at a distance of 10 millimeters. Now, you can do this a few different ways. If you just hit G on the keyboard for the shortcut key for move, and Z on the keyboard, it will lock this to your cursor, and you can quickly and easily move it. And you can hit Tab a couple times to get over to those dimensions. So you can do it without actually going down and clicking move. It's a very quick process, but for new users, we want to try to avoid those shortcut keys until you learn what you're doing. With it still selected, we're going to use the mirror option, and then we're going to select the green axis, which is Y, and then right click to accept. I'm going to hide the solid body for now, use my line tool, and connect these 2 points, right click to accept, and we'll do the same thing over here, right click to accept. These are all 4 individual lines, so I'm going to box select them, and then I'm going to join them together. So as we look down here, by default, what it's trying to do is it's trying to extrude it. I don't want to extrude it. What I want to do is just have the line selected. So I'm going to select each curve, moving our way over, holding down Shift, and notice that now we've got a Join Curves option. Remember, this is contextual, and it's based on your selection. So hitting Join Curves now makes a single curve, and we can easily keep this organized inside of our outliner. Let's bring the solid body back, select the profile, and begin pulling it out. Once again, hitting Tab, and looking at our shortcut keys, we want to use the Difference option. So W, and then select our object. And we'll right-click to accept, select our curve, and hide it. So what we did was we cut through the center of that object by using that, it's basically that profile. Next, if we want to do any adjustments over here, perhaps make it a bit narrower, we can follow the same process. Go to a front view, we can use the same tools. So for example, I can start maybe make an angle down to here, right click to accept, and then we can make a line. I'm going to go from the origin, and then I'm going to move it up. So again, move, Z, and in this case, let's say 10 millimeters again, just to keep it consistent. We'll temporarily hide the solid, and we'll use our trim tool to trim away these. And if this happens, if you notice that the trim tool doesn't actually trim the overlapping curves. What is likely to have happened, and this is a very common occurrence, is that when we were drawing that line, it didn't snap to the XY plane. It actually snapped to geometry out in space. So if I rotate this around, you can see that this line is on the XY axis, but this one is not. Now there's an easy way that we can handle this. We can move this. So we can say G, and then we can move it to that location if we know the distance. If there's a snap point that we could use that as well. But probably the most common way, and probably the one that you wouldn't think of, is to scale it. So we're going to use the scale tool. We're going to scale in the Y direction, but what we want to do is change the pivot point. So you can see here it's called V on the keyboard. We're going to hit V. I'm going to set the pivot point at the origin, and then we're going to scale in Y. And so what this means is as we scale down in Y, we're going to set Y to 0. We're going to leave the scale in X and Z the same. And what this actually does is it scales it all the way down to where our cursor was so that Y equals 0. Because the geometry isn't actually going to change in that orientation, all it's doing is it's pushing it down to 0 without needing a snap location for where those points are. So now if we use the trim tool, we should have no problem trimming those two curves and right-clicking to accept. We can also select both of them, and again, we can join them together with J on the keyboard if needed. Let's bring the solid body back just to see what we've done. Next, I want to create a closed profile here. So I'm going to start with the line tool, left-click to start my line, and you'll notice that we get this red or pink line. This is our snap position. I'm going to hover over this point, tap and let go of Shift, and notice now we get the extension lines for where we need to end this. So I'm going to left-click here and left-click here, then right-click to accept. The reason that that's important is because we can use those to extend at a tangency direction. We can use it to extend so that we have 90 degrees between these edges, and it really helps overall. So we're going to shift select, join, and now we've got a single set of polylines or lines, and this can be used as a cut tool. At this point, with it selected, I'm going to go ahead and mirror it about Y, and then I'm going to take both of these, extend it out, hit Tab, and then we're going to hit W. Select our object, and then right-click to accept. Next, let's go ahead and take this, and we'll hide it. So H on the keyboard, or you can select the eyeball icon. So now you can see we were able to take this section down, but what ended up happening, the original extra lip that we put on the top of this doesn't make sense anymore. We cut it away, and it's completely gone. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add it back. We're going to find the original circles that we used. And we've got a circle here and we've got a circle here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this circle and we're going to use a direct modeling tool by imprinting or cutting the face of our part. So we can hide this one. We don't need that one. We only need this one. The way that we're going to do this is by hitting Shift and I. The Shift and I is an imprint curve tool, which you can also find by hitting F on the keyboard. Then we're going to select our object and right-click. Go ahead and hide the circle, but notice what it did was it divided this face up, which means now I can select the face, hold down Shift, select this face, and begin pulling that out. This is a quick way to do this, and I'm going to add 5 millimeters and then hit Enter, or right-click to accept, and then left-click to deselect that face. So even though we cut away that geometry by accident, we were able to make it up by going in and using the same original curve. And we could have extruded it, but we also did an imprint. What you're going to find is that using tools like imprint, or if you're using a curve like the line, a knife tool that lets you divide up faces is going to be a rapid way that you can create complex geometry. The other way that we can do this is by selecting a face and using the offset tool. We use the offset tool on our curve, but we can also use it by hitting O and create an offset on the face of our object. This may be a little bit easier to see on this side. Let's go ahead and use this one here. So I'm going to hit O on the keyboard, and you can see that I'm able to pull and make that offset. And then I could take this and I could pull it out, or I could push it in and make adjustments to the overall shape. Now for us, I'm not going to do that, so I'll hit Control and Z and undo. But that is a quick way that we can manipulate geometry. Now that we're mostly done, we need to add some fillets and chamfers to round this thing off and sort of finish it. So we're going to do that by going to our edge selection, and we're going to start with these inside edges. I'm going to select one and pull it in. I'm going to give it a value of 12 millimeters in both directions, and then hold down the Control key to add to my selection. So as soon as I hit Control, it'll temporarily disable my preview. Then I can move around and select these other edges. Because we have X-ray on, we should be able to select everything without changing the view, but it's a good idea to rotate this around just to double check. If you want to, you can select more edges, for example, these edges here, but note that you may end up with a failed preview if this fillet ends up cutting into that corner. So you may find that you need to right-click to accept, and then come back and maybe apply another fillet. In this case, I'm going to say 10 and 10, and then hold down Control over here. You can see that it's automatically grabbing that side. We'll do this one over here, and maybe this one here. And if you need to, again, rotate around, holding down Control to temporarily disable, and right-click to accept. A couple more that we want to apply. Let's go in here, hold down Control. At this point, I'm not going to worry too much about the dimensions. I'm just going to go ahead and manually apply them so that they visually look okay. Right-click to accept, and then we'll do this one here. So start to pull this one out. Hold down Control. Hold down Control. If you make an accidental selection, just deselect it and it'll be okay. And then right-click to accept. Next, we're going to add a chamfer. So with the fillet tool, when you select an edge, if you push it in, you'll get a chamfer. If you pull it out, you get a fillet. You'll have to play around with the direction. Sometimes it ends up being a little bit backwards. So you may just need to just pull it both directions to make sure it's okay. I'm not worried about manufacturing for something like this. Obviously, creating that chamfer on that inside edge would be nearly impossible. But for what we're doing, it doesn't really matter. And then maybe add a small fillet here, or a small chamfer, depending on what you want to do. Hold down Control, select a couple of extra edges. Maybe this one on the outside, and this one here. And maybe this one here. And we'll grab these outside edges as well, just to finish everything off. All right, looks like it does not like that one. We'll come back and deal with that one in a bit. All right, right-click to accept. So this one is likely a problem because of how close it is here, and this edge isn't rounded. So again, you may find that with certain objects, if plasticity is pretty good about making geometry work, but you may find that you need to do it in separate operations just so it has the ability to patch and deal with these corners. There are other options for things like Y-blends, and you can have it attempt those if you've got multiple corners coming together. But in some cases, you'll find you just need to take a step back and just do an extra fillet operation in order to get it to blend. I'm going to turn off X-ray so I'm not looking into the model. And I'm going to right-click up here and turn off my edges and change the appearance and just get a look at what we created. So fairly complex shape. Obviously, we could spend more time making changes, but overall, a fairly complex shape without too much hassle. We obviously could have taken a couple of different steps along the way. We can add or remove more geometry if we want, but I think overall, this shows the power and the potential. Also remember that with perspective on, things are going to look a bit different. Going to go back to our all selection and maybe change our appearance. We're going to go to maybe the red material, toggle off our overlays, and there we go. So obviously this is a sort of a first getting started way to look at plasticity. There are a lot of other options that we have, and this is just a handful. But I'm going to show you a couple of more advanced options, or I'm going to just show you a couple more things so that way you can understand maybe a little bit more about plasticity. So for example, we didn't really have sketch dimensions. We created circles that were 50 millimeters or 75 millimeters, and kind of once we were done, we were done. But we do have some options to deal with that. So for example, If I hit the equal key, this is a dimension tool, and you can see that the center of this is 50 millimeters. If I decided this needed to be 48.5 millimeters, I can use that dimension tool to redimension the size of that face. So I don't have to use offset face and maybe, drag this in or out to get wildly off. I can do that by using the dimension tool. So select the face, hit equal on the keyboard, and set it to 50 millimeters, and there we go. So that's one way that we can redo some of these dimensions. So if you find that you made an object, and let's say you're 3D printing, and it doesn't quite fit right, and you need to make just a minor adjustment. Instead of using offset face, where you're just grabbing it and moving it, select it and use the dimension tool. And again, F on the keyboard, and you can search for these things. There is also a measure tool. Now, the measure tool is something that can be pretty powerful, but there are limitations to it as well. In our case, the measure tool isn't going to work great, but the measure tool allows us to add dimensions to objects, and I'll create a simple object so we can kind of see how this works. So we're going to get a box here, and I'll add another one here. So I'm going to use Control and Equal for dimension. I'm going to select this face. I want to go from this edge to this face. So I'm going to select those, Control and Equal, and let's go to there. You can see we've got 15 millimeters. It's a little hard to see the way it's positioned. Let me zoom in a little bit. So if I decide to move this face, I select it and I use the Move tool. Notice that now it's underlined. If I select it, I can give this a precise measurement. I can make it 12 millimeters exactly. So this allows me to resize features that maybe didn't have this numeric input at the start. Again, it is limited. It doesn't work on everything. It will work on some features, and using the measure tool, again, it's not universal. So if I go from, let's say, this edge to this edge, notice that it didn't dimension it how I expected. If I just select this edge here, and let's say I grab this top face and I try to move it, again, I can click here and I can say 15 millimeters, and it'll update properly. Where you start to run into problems is if the features are too complex to rebuild in that nature. But as you start to create basic prismatic parts, things that are built with these boxes, for example, then you can explore this measure tool and the dimension tool and see if that's able to give you the flexibility that you need. I'm going to go ahead and select and delete that. Again, use / to put my object in the center of the screen. And that's going to be it. So from here, I would suggest if you want to continue to learn plasticity, on this channel, we do have a basic series. It's a 5-part series where we walk through some of the basic modeling approaches, things like using offsets or things like creating sheets and turning them into solids. And then the last video in that series is a modeling practice where we go for 45 minutes, we walk through the process of modeling something. We've also got plenty of other videos on doing things like 3D printed threads or print and place models. And we've got a video on the XNerbs mouse. We've also got a series on concept car modeling. And the speaker, again, is from our learneverythingaboutdesign.com website, where you can buy that course for $10. It's about 2 hours of video, has a downloadable sheet with shortcuts on it for you. And all that information is there. And I'll put everything in the description of this video. And once again, if you are looking to purchase Plasticity, you can use the code LEAD10 at checkout. We are an affiliate channel, so that will save you 10% on your purchase, and it also will help the channel out as well. If you have any questions on this or you want to see more Plasticity content, I do have plenty of other videos planned for other topics that have been requested, but I'm always keeping a list. So if there's anything that you want to see that you haven't seen yet or you'd like me to try to explain, please leave that in the comments. As always,